This was originally going to be the 1,000 subscribers special, but we got about 5,000 subscribers before I could even make a video celebrating. So, here's my favorite stories so far. I've really enjoyed making these videos, and I appreciate all of you for your support. About 13 years ago when I was 18 and had just gotten my first computer, I spent a lot of time exploring some pretty disturbing websites. It was different back then. There wasn't much stopping you from ending up on gore websites. It was quite common to be scrolling through forums and suddenly see a video of someone being beheaded or accidentally watching an execution. Admittedly, I sometimes went out of my way to watch this kind of stuff too. Morbid curiosity, I guess. So, as I ventured down the rabbit hole of the dark web one night, I came across a website that claimed to be an interactive adventure. I loved interactive adventure storybooks and thought a digital version could be even better. Upon entering the site, I was immediately struck by its unusual format. Instead of traditional storytelling choices, it presented a series of hyper-realistic photos showcasing various choices. The story started outside what looked like an abandoned factory. You always had two choices. The first one was pretty simple. You had to choose which door to go into. One door had a no entry sign on it, and the other had a big stop sign. I chose the second one because I figured that'd lead to the more interesting story. Each choice led to a set of photos that portrayed the consequences of your choice. For the first few clicks, it was just navigating the factory. There were all sorts of tools and creepy props all over the place. It looked like a slaughterhouse with what looked like body parts of pigs or some other animal hanging on hooks. The level of realism was shocking, especially back then when the public or some cheap website wouldn't have the funding to make such realistic scenes. The next image had a picture of the woman with her hands clearly chopped off, with only bleeding stumps remaining on her arms. I couldn't believe this game was free. It was so convincing. The two choices now were just save or end. I was not about to end my little journey here, so I clicked save. Again, the website took a few minutes to load and I sat patiently waiting for the next part of the story. I was so numb to gore and this kind of thing after spending enough time on the internet, so I wasn't particularly shocked at the bloody details, just in love with the creativity of this game. The page refreshed and it was an image of the woman again, but this time her hands were bandaged and she's staring right at the camera, absolute terror in her eyes. I thought it was weird that I didn't get to make a choice, but I assumed when you save the game it kind of does a soft reset so that people who made other choices would all lead to that part anyway. I played similar games before, so I knew that often, no matter which choices you make, the game will force you down the path it had planned anyway. Another choice appeared. Man or child. I was a sick little teenager, but I didn't want to see a child getting tortured, even if it was just a game, so I chose the man. A few minutes passed again and then a man appeared in the chair. This time I had the choice between a rope and a baseball bat. I chose the rope, wondering how creative they could get with something so simple. Once again, a short delay between the next image loading, and I maybe started to get a bit bored at this point, but I waited. The next page loaded. The man had the rope around his neck. He was stood on the chair and the rope was attached to a metal beam above. It was crazy how brutal this website was, but part of me loved the intensity. I'd hit another checkpoint asking to save or end. It was at that moment my mom knocked on my bedroom door and I panicked and quickly pressed end. The page went blank just as she walked in. This is where it got seriously creepy. I immediately felt my stomach turn and my heart drop. The picture had loaded. The man who'd been holding the camera the whole time was now looking into a mirror, dressed in some butcher overalls, covered in blood. Leaning against the mirror was the man with the broken neck. His face had some disturbingly realistic details, like his eyes bulging and his face seriously discolored. Two female hands, standing upright on their stubs, were also sitting next to the mirror, both with their thumbs up. It was incredibly morbid, but that wasn't the worst part at all. The worst part was written on the mirror. My name. My address. My mind was racing. I was completely freaking out. I even turned my screen off as if that would do anything. Was this real? Did I just determine the fates of these people? What the hell was going on? How did they have my details? I felt sick. I turned the screen back on and saw the two choices. It said, continue, with yes or no as the options. I immediately clicked no. I was done. I was genuinely so scared. The page started loading again, this time quite a lot faster than usual. The new page was just a zoomed-in image of my name and address, with the option to continue being repeated back at me. This time with save or end as the options. Is that what save meant? Save the woman? And end? Did I choose to end the man? I was drenched in sweat at this point and really panicking. Was this a threat? I have to continue or they'll come for me. Am I choosing to save myself or end myself? I hated everything about this moment. I clicked end and immediately turned the computer off. As you can tell from the fact that I'm telling this story, they never came for me. We did move house a few weeks later for unrelated reasons, so maybe that's why. But I lived in complete fear for at least 3 years after this. Did I really do those things? Was it just a creative game with some clever tricks? It would explain the long loading pages. I don't like to think about it. Well, at least I didn't choose the child. Arriving at prison, I remember the process clearly. We got off the bus and were herded into a reception area called Block 16. Whilst there, they made us strip down, a bunch of us standing butt naked, while the officers did their checks. It was no-nonsense stuff. After that, you approach the desk for fingerprinting and processing. It was there, you'd make a crucial decision. Some guys, like this one I saw, they'd come up to the desk, look the officer dead in the eye, and say something like, "I don't think I'll make it in general population." At that point, the officer would ring a bell, and they'd be moved somewhere else, away from the regular crowd. But if you stayed quiet, like most did, you'd be led to a cell with a cage attached. In that cage, you'd sit for hours, sometimes the whole day, as they sorted you out. I remember the bell ringing often. People freaking out and rushing to the desk to ring the bell, only to end up in a smaller, darker cell out of earshot from the rest of us. It was scorching that day, probably over 100 degrees outside, and you're just cramped inside that cell. Lunchtime came, and we got sandwiches. I'll admit, the food was better than the county's cheap stuff. I recall one meal particularly, chicken enchiladas with green sauce. It tasted real, like something that might actually fatten you up. There were some wild characters in there, no doubt about it. They knew there was a white guy among us, they'd seen him on the bus. This guy named Reggie, he didn't have any weapon. We'd just come on transport, but he was busy sharpening a pencil like a man on a mission. He took his sweet time, and when he was good and ready, he jammed that pencil right into the neck of another guy. It was the first day in reception, and he just went at it, puncturing holes in the other guy's neck, and that guy went down fast. I was there, watching it all, thinking this trip was going to be one heck of a ride. In those cramped cages, we'd munch on our sandwiches, the stifling heat suffocating us. It had to be a scorching 110 degrees, at least. Finally, they'd come to move you from that holding cell to your assigned one. That's when it got real. You'd be alone in that cell for 10 long days. No contact with anyone. Reception was like a test. They needed to figure out who you were and where you belonged. Everyone always asks about the first day in prison, and this was the reality. The real deal, right there in reception. You'd roll in, be herded into that cramped cell with a bunch of strangers until they processed you, and then you'd be placed in your solitary cell, waiting for your fate to be decided. During my 2 weeks in that cell, I noticed some graffiti on the wall. Someone had drawn SpongeBob SquarePants and scribbled the lines of the theme song. It made you think about the kind of people you were about to join. 2 weeks of isolation were the norm. I had to be patient until they figured out my custody level, who I was, and where I was headed. Meanwhile, I thought about the simple things, like how that sandwich I had in reception was a rare taste of normalcy. Block 17 is within walking distance of reception, and this block was a constant source of trouble. I end up with this standalone skinhead as my cellmate. He claims to be a skinhead but isn't officially affiliated, he just labels himself. And let me tell you, we had our fair share of issues. This guy used to be a massive dude, easily tipping the scales at 260 pounds, but he lost a ton of weight, way too fast, leaving him with all this saggy extra skin. Initially, he seemed alright, but then he ended up in debt with the wrong people and started acting out. Him being in debt was bad for me, because the trouble would come to my cell, and I didn't want that. Every time food came around, I'd wolf down as much as I wanted, even if it was his. That's where the real problems began. He got all worked up because of some peanut butter. I wanted that peanut butter all to myself, and I made it clear to him, saying, "Hey, buddy, none of this is for you. It's mine. Get lost." Well, he didn't take too kindly to that. From there our tensions boiled over, and I can't even remember how it escalated, but we started throwing punches. Then, this overweight fellow managed to get me in some sort of guillotine chokehold, shoving my neck down while applying pressure to the back of my head. I was furious. I yelled, "I'm going to murder you when you release me, fatty." My neighbor, Scooby, heard the commotion through the vent. He hollered over, asking if everything was all right. I replied, telling him Mike's got his fat titties choking me out. The moment he frees me, I'm going to lay a beating on his fat ass. Mike finally started easing up on my neck, cautioning me not to do anything stupid. I snapped back, "Nah, the second he lets go, I'm unleashing hell on this bitch." Eventually, he released me, and, as expected, I swung at him, landing a few solid hits. He sat there afterward, sporting a bloody nose and a swollen lip, asking if everything was settled. I told him he was a punk, and yes, it was settled. Then there's this other incident. I'm just minding my own business when one of the higher-ranking skinheads strolls up. He's repping SKS or something, which is a white clique of skinheads. He eyeballs me and says, "You've got a Jewish tat?" I shot back, "Yeah, I've got the King of Jews tatted on me." "What's up, you punk? Got a problem?" Right then and there, he punked out in front of everyone. He let me straight up call him a punk, basically folded like a cheap suit. I glanced around, thinking, this dude's toast. In prison, especially as a white guy, you cannot let anyone call you a punk. Whether it's a fellow white guy or anyone else joking around, you've got to fire back at them. There's no other option. If you don't, well, like I mentioned earlier, you're getting messed up. That's just how it rolls in the penitentiary. In the end, it was all about manipulation. Some people would manipulate the system to their advantage, even if it meant getting in trouble or putting their lives at risk. It was a dangerous game, and you couldn't trust anyone fully. The wildest part of this whole scene was my neighbor, 2 cells down. They start rounding up all the white guys, and it's strip search time. Now, this guy, he's got a 7-inch blade hanging out of his ass. As they strip us down, he's got it tucked halfway in a plastic bag, the handle barely sticking out. It's a monstrous knife, the kind you'd never believe could fit where it does. You might be thinking, that's some sickening stuff, who shoves a 7-inch knife up their ass? But this is the stark reality of prison. You're dealing with people who don't think like you. This dude is ready to do whatever it takes, even if it means using that knife, whether it's on a fellow inmate or a damn cop. So, yeah, he did what he had to do. All of this was within a few weeks of being there. Sounds sick? Yeah, well then don't end up in prison. Punk. been chatting with this girl online for weeks, and she seemed like the perfect match for me. So when she suggested we meet at hers, which happened to be in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't resist the adventure. My GPS had guided me through the labyrinth of back roads with the promise that I was nearing her location. But as I rounded yet another bend, I found myself in the middle of a seemingly abandoned junkyard. Rusty old cars and worn-down buildings loomed in the darkness. The place was only lit by my car and the moonlight. Confusion turned to fear as I realized this was the wrong place. Panic set in when the harsh glare of headlights suddenly appeared behind me. A group of burly men, their faces obscured by the shadows, blocked my way and surrounded my truck. One of them, clearly the leader, approached my window. His eyes were filled with suspicion. "What the hell are you doing here, boy? This is private property." My words tumbled out in a rush as I explained my predicament, that I was supposed to meet someone nearby, but my GPS had led me astray. They exchanged glances, their suspicion turning into a sinister grin. Sure, the leader said, "but you see, we've been having some trouble with trespassers lately. Can't be too careful, you know?" His companions chuckled ominously. Without another word, I threw my car into reverse and backed out of there as fast as I could. My heart was pounding. I turned the car around quicker than I thought was possible, and I fumbled with the GPS, trying to tell it to return home. The men continued to shout at me as I sped away, but my troubles were far from over. My GPS, unable to keep up with my rapid escape, soon led me onto an even narrower road. Darkness surrounded me as I ventured further into the woods. My anxiety was making my legs shake aggressively, and my hands could barely follow simple instructions. With no cell service and no signs of civilization, I was well and truly lost. Suddenly, as if mocking my desperation, a deer bounded out from the shadows and onto the road. Panic surged through me as I slammed on the brakes, screeching almost to a complete stop. The deer barely reacted and just continued to slowly prance down the road. Suddenly, I noticed the rednecks from the junkyard had caught up, their truck now dangerously close behind me. They were leaning on the horn, yelling obscenities, and I really started to feel like I wasn't getting out of this alive. Desperation pushed me to follow the deer. I drove at a crawl, praying the animal would move aside. But it just dominated the road in front of me for a painful amount of time. It continued to run ahead of me. The longer it was there, the more it started to look like some type of demon. It looked like something you'd see in Norse mythology. Its horns looked like human arms reaching into the sky. My heart raced as I watched the creature's every move. The rednecks were relentless, inching closer, their voices growing louder, getting even angrier. The suspense was unbearable. I was trapped behind the deer, with nowhere to go, and a group of hostile men closing in behind me. The narrow road seemed to stretch on forever, and with every passing second I couldn't help imagine all of the different ways that I was going to be killed. The men in the truck behind me were starting to push into the back of my car, and I could hear the revving of their engine, eager to push me off the road. I really started to panic and started honking at the deer. I even contemplated abandoning my car and fleeing into the darkness, but I knew that would be futile. They would catch me within moments. As we continued our awful drive on that terrible road, the deer suddenly leaped to the side, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I seized the opportunity and accelerated. When I looked back in my mirror, I saw the deer jump out again right in front of their truck. They slammed on the brakes and were frantically shouting at it to get out of the way. I'm sure they had no issue with killing a deer, but ramming it with their truck at that slow speed would likely just make it angry, and it wouldn't be worth the damage. I didn't hesitate for a second as I went full speed down the rest of the road, hitting every bump with no regard for the condition of my car. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart still pounding, until I finally stumbled upon a small town. There, I found my bearings and eventually made it to the nearest motel. It was only when I locked the door behind me that I felt safe enough to breathe. As I lay in bed, trying to process what had happened, I couldn't help wondering about that deer. Was it merely a coincidence, a strange twist of fate? Or did it know what it was doing, sensing my fear, deciding to lead me away from danger and preventing them from chasing me? I'd almost completely forgotten about my date, and when I checked the app to tell her what had happened, she'd unmatched. I have mixed thoughts about the whole thing. Was she a catfish the whole time, luring me into danger? Did she think that I had ghosted her, so she unmatched out of embarrassment? I kind of believe that she set me up, either as a prank or as part of the junkyard group. What their plan was, I'm not sure. But I've given up with dating apps. I was 13 when this happened to me. I stayed at my friend's house almost every weekend. She had a huge bedroom and I just lived with my mom in a small apartment, so whenever I stayed there it felt like I had a taste of what a real family home felt like. That would be true if it wasn't for the constant arguing that I hear from her parents. Her dad was always really nice to me, pretty much treating me like his own daughter. He'd buy us food and DVDs and make sure that we had the best sleepovers every week. Her mom, on the other hand, was always quite cold with me. She wouldn't really even speak to me. Most of the arguments that I could hear were her shouting at him. Looking back, I realized that she was emotionally manipulating him, claiming he didn't love her and accusing him of being sleazy. But at the time, I just thought this was what parents would do every night. Anyway, we would mostly just turn up the TV and distract ourselves from the shouting, and usually we'd have a really good night. This night was different. Her dad basically rushed us up to her room and we could tell he was stressed. I tried asking my friend about her parents, but she just deflected and said she didn't want to talk about it. We did our makeup and hair and tried on different outfits throughout the night, and within a few hours we were almost falling asleep whilst watching the first Twilight film. Suddenly we could hear her parents arguing really loudly. There were bangs and the sounds of things smashing. This wasn't normal. I could hear her mom practically screaming at her dad, throwing the usual accusations and seemingly hitting him. I know this because he was shouting stop. At some point he started to make his way upstairs and I hear him slam the door to their bedroom just next to the room we were staying in. It wasn't long until her mom made her way upstairs and burst into their room. I heard him shouting, "What the hell?" And then lots of screaming and shouting. The whole house was practically shaking as they were throwing each other around their room and knocking into the wall. I felt really uncomfortable at this point and asked if we could lock the door. My friend agreed and reminded me to be quiet. Just as I clicked the lock, the screams and shouting went silent. My friend and I stared at each other, waiting until we heard one of them go downstairs or to make any kind of noise. Nothing. We waited for minutes, listening at the door and speculating what was happening. Had they just gone to sleep after all that shouting? Unlikely. Suddenly, I hear footsteps and rush back to bed. There's a gentle knock on the door. "Honey, are you awake?" Her mom was coming to check on us. She literally never did this. Before my friend could respond, her mom tried to open the door. She realized it was locked and then immediately started shouting loudly, "Open the door! Now!" I looked at my friend with begging eyes and told her not to open it. Her mom started pleading with us through the door, kicking it loudly, sending massive shocks throughout the room. Her mom turned her attention to me and started ordering me to open the door, gradually getting more nasty, telling me I was a leech and that I would end up like my mother, alone and miserable. I started crying and so did my friend. At this point I called my mom and told her what was happening. She could hear the door being kicked and the nasty comments, and she told us to put something in front of the door. She told me she had to hang up for a moment whilst she called the police, and we were both left there waiting for this terrifying moment to be over. The banging stopped and I could hear her mom's footsteps going down the hallway. The footsteps came back towards us and then things got seriously disturbing. The end of a knife burst through the door. It was shiny and long, and she repeatedly stabbed the door, gradually chipping away at the cheap wood. We were obviously screaming uncontrollably at this point, and I have a vivid memory of exactly when I noticed something terrible. As the knife came through the door, I noticed that the white paint around the hole started to turn red. It looked like the door was bleeding. My first thought was that she'd hurt herself whilst on her rampage, but my friend's screams suddenly made me realize exactly what had happened. She started screaming for her dad. It hadn't even crossed my mind. She'd only walked a few steps to go and collect this knife. Why would she have a knife in her bedroom, and why would it be covered in blood? Up until this point, I thought we were just going to be in trouble with her psychotic mom. Maybe she would take away our snacks and make us go to bed, or send me home. I was pretty naive, but it just didn't cross my mind that she was going to kill us. The door was slowly coming apart and she was just grunting loudly every time she'd stab the door. She was evidently getting tired, but she wasn't giving up. My friend was still screaming for her dad and I was a complete mess, crying and pleading for her mom to stop. She started trying to reach her hand through one of the cracks she'd made, but she couldn't reach the lock. At this point, when she'd reached for the lock through the smashed door, she was ripping her skin along her forearm, desperately trying to get in. Her arm was flailing around through the hole. We both cuddled up in the corner of the room, exhausted from all the crying. She was going to get through, and there was nothing us small girls could do to stop her. We both hear something that makes us stop sobbing, and we look directly into each other's eyes. Police sirens. The cops were here and we were going to be saved. Her mom clearly heard them as well, because she started going feral on this door. She was screaming and smashing at it with both hands, occasionally stabbing wildly at the hole she made. We'd thrown a small bedside table and a chair next to the door, which lined up perfectly with her wardrobe, creating a line of furniture that perfectly blocked the door from opening, even if it was unlocked. The cops started banging on the front door and she made the choice to violently shove her arm through the hole, ripping open her arm. I watched as she pushed through the pane, finally reaching the door lock. She'd done it. She was nearly inside. She opened the door a few inches before our barricade stopped her from pushing it any further. Her hand once again reached through and started clawing at the bedside table we put there. She was gradually moving it and it was clear she was making progress. She pushed through enough that her shoulder was now in the room and her arm was slowly shifting the table to the side. All while this is happening, the police are smashing the front door, reacting to our terrified screams. All at once, we hear the door downstairs give way, the cops shouting for us, their footsteps running up the stairs. Her mom must have used all her energy to force the door open and lunged straight towards us. We were crouched in the corner, unable to quickly react. She landed on my friend and gripped her neck with ferocity. I remember how fast she turned purple. She was still holding my hand and struggling wildly, trying to get free whilst her own mother was choking the life out of her. The cops burst into the room, immediately tackling her to the ground. There was so much screaming and shouting and flashlights, and I think they even used a taser. It was overwhelming. My friend lay next to me, barely breathing and having a seizure. They ran to her aid, and one female cop kept checking me and asking me if I was okay, scanning me for injuries and trying to get a response from me. I think I just froze at this point because I don't remember much of what happened after. I know we went to hospital for a while and I remember them putting a shiny blanket on me, which made no sense to me at the time. Throughout the night we learned that her dad had been stabbed to death. I think he had over 80 stab wounds, all over his body. Her mom was sent to a psych ward and remains there today, over 10 years later. I never saw my friend again after that night. She was sent away to live with her grandparents. It completely messed me up for years. I was a dark and troubled teenager. Even now I have terrible anxiety around staying at other people's houses. I used to dream about having both parents living at home together, but I realize now that my home life was much better than what my friend had.
You better kill the groove, DJ. Gonna burn this goddamn house right down. I know.
A few years back, I worked part-time covering as a karaoke host at a local bar. I've had a few run-ins with drunken idiots, but this one was by far the scariest. I'd only been working there about 3 weeks at this point. Prior to me, it had been 3 different girls hosting, so I was the first guy. While training, they warned me if I ever felt uncomfortable to call for security. I immediately took that as guys getting too handsy with the girls, so I figured I wouldn't have any issues since I was the first guy here. I quickly learned that the difference for me would be that people tend to get more aggressive with a guy than with a girl. So it was a Saturday night and I was hosting. It was about 1 a.m. and almost everyone in the bar was drunk, and karaoke had been going pretty smoothly. So I call someone up, and he says he wants to sing Zombie by the Cranberries. Problem is, someone sang it like 40 minutes earlier, and one of the few rules we have is no repeat songs. He immediately starts ignoring me telling him this and just keeps repeating that he wants to sing that song. Finally, I get his attention and explain to him that he can't, it just isn't happening. He immediately steps to within about 6 inches of me and says, "You're gonna let me sing that effing song." He then turns away and starts talking into the mic. I tell him one more time, either you sing something else or you don't sing. He then tells me to kill myself and starts ranting about it into the microphone. He was a weird guy, he looked like he'd been crying and he was quite drunk. So now I'm actually mad. I turn his mic all the way down, turn mine all the way up, and call for security. One of the bartenders immediately starts coming towards the stage and the guy turns to get in my face again. Now, this is where it gets kind of silly. I'm like 5 feet 11 inches and 160 pounds, not a huge guy by any stretch of the imagination. The guy giving me shit is a good 3 inches taller than me and about the same build. The bartender, on the other hand, is about 6 feet 2 inches and 230 pounds with a massive beard and does kickboxing for fun. He's jacked and scary. He gets in the guy's face and the guy immediately steps back and starts talking about how he's so self-conscious about his singing and it's the only song he loves, but he understands the rules and just misunderstood me. It was kind of funny how quickly he backed down. He asked me one more time to let him sing that song and told me it was his girlfriend's favorite. I told him we just can't do it, but I'd let him choose another song. He took some time before finally choosing Rage Against the Machine. The one that explicitly says, "I won't do what you tell me." As the bartender is walking away, the drunk guy says into the microphone, "This song is about fighting against tyrants." My coworker immediately does a 180 and gets about 5 feet away from him and says, "If the next words out of your mouth are words to that song, I'm going to throw you out." Something in him snapped at this point. He picked up the microphone, looked me right in the eyes and said, "I'm going to sing that song tonight." The bartender immediately grabbed him and threw him out of the club. He came back over to me and apologized, but I wasn't bothered at all. I honestly thought the guy would just sing along to the second song choice. The lyrics are literally, "F you, I won't do what you tell me." It would have been more entertaining. We never really had too many issues at this club, so security wasn't exactly tight. The night went on, a few more groups came up to sing different songs, and I'd completely forgotten about the emotional drunk. It must have been about an hour later when suddenly I see a bit of commotion at the entrance. The bartender is blocking someone's path and clearly gesturing for them to leave. I obviously couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see that he was getting physical with someone. That's when things took a turn. The sound was unmistakable. I saw the bartender fall down onto the floor almost immediately and people around him started panicking. As he fell, I saw the man he was arguing with. It was the emotional drunk guy from earlier. I was positioned in a cramped little hut with a DJ deck and the only way out was the doorway directly facing him, so I just crouched down and tried peeking through a gap. I watched in terror as he walked straight towards me. He aimed the gun directly at my face and with tears in his eyes, he demanded I play Zombie by the Cranberries. I started to talk, about to beg for my life, when he interrupted and said, "I don't care about the stupid rule." Like he thought I was going to mention the repeated song rule with a gun pointed at me. "Please. Just do it. I have nothing against you." I agreed to his request and told him I was finding the song. He grabbed the microphone and got into position in the middle of the dance floor. I pressed play and he immediately closed his eyes and looked up, patiently waiting for the intro of the song to end. He starts singing, and I hate to say it, but he was pretty good. He was putting raw emotion into his singing. He was using his arms a lot to gesture, which meant that the gun was pointing all over and I was constantly flinching. Practically everybody had ran out of the club at this point, and I was still trapped in my stupid DJ hut. I think I was too scared to move, but also completely struck by the bizarre experience. As the lyric portion of the song came to an end, he started to look around. I felt a flush go through my whole body as I realized what was about to happen. He looked down at the gun, then towards the bartender on the floor, then back at me. "I'm so sorry." His first shot missed me, as far as I could tell. I immediately started to sprint out of my hut. I had a million thoughts racing through my head as I anticipated his next shot in my back. I'd heard stories about people not realizing they'd been shot because of the adrenaline. I was convinced I was bleeding out and about to collapse. I was running so fast, wondering why I wasn't dead yet. I jumped over the bartender's dead body and made it out of the front door. The crowd screamed when I burst out, and I had cops pointing their guns at me, ordering me to get down. I was alive. But why? After the cops clarified who I was, they pushed in and went to clear the club. It turns out he didn't shoot at me. He shot himself. Straight in the head. Looking back, I think I understand his apology now. He never wanted to kill the bartender, he just wanted to sing that song one last time, and he was the one person in his way. Over the next few weeks we learned more about this guy. His girlfriend had just died and it broke him. They were apparently regulars at the club, and that was their favorite song. I'm not sure if he'd planned on killing himself that night or if the confrontation led him to think it was a good idea, but the whole thing was so messed up. The club shut down after that incident. Nobody wanted to go there anymore, and rumors started that the place was haunted. I moved on to other things and try not to think about it too much. It gave me a new appreciation for life, even if that song gives me panic attacks. This all happened just recently, in summer this year. I'd been living with my parents until I had a good enough job to move out. About 9 months ago, I was finally ready to leave the nest. The place I found wasn't the nicest neighborhood, but it wasn't too bad. Some of my neighbors actually came over to welcome me and gave me some food. There was one neighbor though, the guy who lived to the right of me, who wasn't exactly welcoming, but immediately comfortable with me like we'd known each other for a long time. He'd see me leaving for work in the morning and run out of his house to tell me random stories, like how the last neighbor used to always turn the bathroom light on at 3 a.m. and leave it on all night. Or that they would sunbathe in the garden for 5 hours sometimes. It was all very random, boring facts, and I'd barely get a chance to react to his stories before he was asking me intrusive questions. Like, why did you leave for 83 minutes last night? It's worth noting that his voice was a bit odd. He spoke with a very particular inflection every time he'd say something. Like an enthusiastic nerd, if that makes sense. Sometimes it made his statements sound like accusations, and sometimes it made them sound like questions, but my response to his comments were never really met with conversation. I would kind of laugh it off and just give him a short answer, like, I had to grab some groceries for tomorrow. But he'd be really quick to interrupt and remind me that the last neighbor never took 83 minutes to grab groceries. And he'd say it with an almost accusatory tone. Like what I was saying was ridiculous. I assumed he was just a bit odd and didn't call him out on his intrusive questions too much. This continued for weeks. He either ran out to come and question me about my day-to-day activity, or he'd come knocking at random hours to tell me facts about my life. He would tell me that he noticed that I left at 8:33 this morning instead of the usual 8:26. I had different ways of reacting to this, sometimes thanking him for letting me know, sometimes being rather dismissive, but always friendly. He was never interested in any other kind of conversation. He'd tell me his observations and then leave. The months went by, and his behavior continued. Almost every day he'd stop me in the morning or come knocking to tell me something about his observations. He seemed harmless, so I just let him do his thing. One evening while I was going for drinks across the road, I asked my neighbor if she ever had any issues with him. She paused almost immediately and looked at me with a serious expression. What happened? She seemed really worried when she asked me. I explained to her that he would approach me constantly to tell me that he'd seen me turning on specific lights in the house at night, or that he'd point out changes in my usual routine. Nothing terrifying, but still creepy. At this point, she turned the music off and put her glass down. You need to be careful around him. She seemed disturbed, like I triggered a repressed memory. The people who lived in that house before you were so sweet. I can't prove it, but I know that they're gone because of him. Gone? What did she mean, gone? I pushed her to tell me more, but she apologized and turned the music back on and changed the subject, ending the conversation. She did stop at one point to just make sure I locked my doors and not to invite him in at any point. That night, as I made my way back home, I watched his house closely as I crossed the road. It was noticeably dark. I'd never really paid it much attention, but I don't think I ever saw his lights on after dark. Whereas every other house on the street had at least a few lights in different rooms. I got to my door and paused. I looked towards his house one more time. I saw exactly what I was hoping not to. A glimpse of light. He was peeking at me. How long had he been watching the neighbor's house to know that I was over there? Was this all he did? Watch me? I went inside and remembered what my neighbors said. How often did I not even think about locking the door? Honestly, I think most nights I wouldn't even check. I clicked the lock and made my way to the back door. I took the key from the side and made sure it was locked. I put the key back in its usual place and made my way upstairs. As I dressed down into my underwear and made my way under my covers, I reached over and turned off the lamp. It had been a long night, so I started to drift off quite fast. Did I hear that? Was that knocking? I sat on the side of my bed and waited, anticipating more knocks. About a minute passed and I didn't hear any more knocking, so I assumed I just dreamt it as I was half asleep. I lay back onto my bed and closed my eyes once again. No. I definitely heard something. I was in a weird state of being half asleep and a little bit tipsy, so I threw the light on and made my way to the window. I couldn't see anything or anyone outside. The sound of me opening my window was loud enough for any visitor to hear. I called out into the darkness, asking if anyone was there. At this point, any normal person would step into view and show themselves, but nobody reacted. Nothing. I know that someone was knocking. I threw on my dressing gown and made my way downstairs. I went straight to the front door. It had shaded glass that let me see partially through it. There was clearly a figure standing in front of the door. I was freaking out, but I was also angry. I didn't even consider the danger. I started fumbling with the lock and threw the door open.
You left your house for 157 minutes.
What the hell? I snapped. This was the latest he ever visited. Everything about his behavior had really annoyed me. The fact that I called out of the window and he didn't respond, and instead stood with his nose practically touching my front door. Why did you feel the need to tell me that? At this late in the night. I was falling asleep.
You've been out very late.
I know that. I'm an adult. I'm allowed to go out late. I realized I was reacting to his accusatory tone. Is that all? You wanted to tell me I'd been out late? He started to just walk away, back to his house. I yelled to him that I didn't want him to knock on my door again. He didn't react, just kept walking towards his house and went inside. I'd tolerated his weirdness for long enough. I convinced myself I wouldn't let him commentate my life schedule anymore, and that next time he talks to me I was going to tell him I don't care and just keep walking. I closed the door and went straight back to bed, still frustrated with how intrusive and weird he was. I closed my eyes and imagined what I would say to him the next time I saw him. I felt really tired and had no problems getting back to sleep. As expected, I had the weirdest dream. Whenever I had a few drinks, I'd always have such vivid dreams. I could hear that damn gentle knocking. I didn't jolt awake this time. I almost convinced my subconscious dream state to ignore the imaginary knocking. But I was fully aware of every creepy little thing that was happening. I started wondering if I'd locked the door. I knew I'd locked it earlier, but did I lock it after I opened it again to confront him? I couldn't remember. I hated how realistic my dreams were. Of all the scenarios I could think about, did I really have to imagine him breaking into my house and walking up my stairs? I feel like I'd never been so consciously aware during any of my dreams. I was dreaming that I was locked in place, sleeping on my side, with my back to the door. His breathing sounded so real. If it wasn't for the alcohol in my system, I would have definitely woken up. This was by far the creepiest dream I ever had. I dreamt that he was climbing into bed with me, wrapping his arm around my waist and playing with my hair. I felt absolutely disgusted, but the soft touches also felt relaxing and pushed me deeper into the dream. I was urging myself to wake up at this point. My mind kept racing back to the thought that I actually hadn't locked the door. I needed to get up. His breathing was so intense. It felt so real. His touch felt real. This was unlike any dream I'd ever had. I was urging myself to wake up. I felt paralyzed. Wake up. Wake the hell up. My eyes finally opened and I could still feel his touch.
Why didn't you lock the door?
I jumped up. His voice immediately jolted me awake. He was in my bed. I screamed and ran straight down the stairs and out into the night. I was still screaming as I ran across the road and started banging on my neighbor's door. I was freezing, only wearing my underwear and completely barefoot. I banged aggressively on her door and shouted her name until she came down. She opened the door in a daze and I pushed my way in. I frantically explained what had happened whilst begging her to lock the door and call the police. We watched out of the window. My front door was wide open, just as I'd left it. The cops were on their way and my friend was comforting me as I got into some of her clothes and told her all of the details. Minutes passed as we stared out of that window. My friend asked if I was sure he was there and it wasn't just a bad dream. I started to doubt myself when we didn't see him leaving. I wasn't the sensitive type. I wouldn't make up that whole scenario out of fear. I had a vivid memory of him lying in bed with me and touching me and talking to me. It was real. I know it was. The cops showed up after about 15 minutes and started to enter the house, guns drawn. We watched intently, waiting for them to bring him out in cuffs. They were in there for quite a while and I started to think that he'd locked himself in my room or something. After what felt like forever, the cops started to leave my house. They were alone. He wasn't with them. I couldn't believe it. I was not crazy. He was in my house. I know he was. I made my way outside to speak to the cops and ask where he was, but they confirmed that they found nothing and searched everywhere. I frantically told them that I was not going back into that house with him still in there. That's when the worst thing that could have happened, happened. He walked out of his house. He stood there, just watching. I was freaking out, demanding that they arrest him and insisting that he was in my house. His expression didn't change, he didn't even flinch. He just turned and walked back inside. Yes, I was drunk and I was pretty emotional at this point, but I couldn't believe that they didn't listen to me. They told me that they'd searched the entire place and there was no intruder. They said that the person who I claimed was an intruder was clearly in their own home, so I should just go inside and get some sleep. There were no signs of forced entry and no damage or evidence of an intruder, so there was nothing they could do. After a while of me practically begging them to at least go and interview him, one officer did go over and speak to him, but it seemed like a very short conversation. He confirmed that he did come over initially to check on me, as I looked drunk, but then went straight home. I was furious, but also terrified. I eventually went back inside and searched the house for any evidence that he was there. I was almost starting to doubt myself, until I checked the back door. It was unlocked, and the key was still in the door. I never left the key in the door, ever. He'd left through the back whilst I was hiding across the street. He'd been in my house and there was nothing I could do about it. I made my way upstairs after properly locking every door. The sick freak had made my bed. It was perfectly tidy and the covers and pillows were placed perfectly. He didn't even rush out after I woke up. He just tidied my bed and then left through the back door. I climbed in and tried to fall asleep, but there was an overwhelming musky smell. His unwashed body had tainted my covers and his odor lingered all over my room. It took me hours to replace all of my bedding and finally get to sleep. The next morning I couldn't shake the feeling of being violated, but I also doubted the whole night. The police had been inside my house, a bunch of men in heavy uniform. That could explain the smell. The key being in the back door, maybe they were checking to see if it was the right key for that lock, confirming that nobody had stolen it. Even the tiny pillows had an explanation. I told them he was in my bed. So it makes sense that they'd throw my bedding onto the floor if they were looking for him, and then maybe one of them just put it back and tidied it up for me. I followed my usual morning routine, and then at 8:30 as I approached my front door, I took a deep breath, anticipating his presence. I left my house and headed towards the road, looking in his direction as soon as I stepped outside. There he was, walking out of his house to greet me. Like clockwork. I froze and tensed up, ready to scream or punch him if he got too close.
You're running 3 minutes later than usual. Did you remember to lock your door this time?